Ciao people, and welcome to our 158th episode of Gold Standard, the Oscars movie podcast, where we travel through time, reviewing the films that earn their gold statue, or standard if you will, and beyond. I am one of your co-hosts, DJ Nick, and sadly I am bereft because today neither the professional nerd herself, Rachel Friend, nor the Ghostwood girl Zan Sprouse will be joining us today, but do not fret folks, they will return. And also another great reason to be happy is I am not alone, as making her return to the podcast and bringing her film selection to the Gold Standard Theatre is Miss Beth Ann Gallagher. Hey Beth, how are you, and welcome back.
Thank you so much for asking me back. I'm happy to be back, and I am doing well.
Well, we're
In
very, very
sweaty,
happy.
hot, old Massachusetts.
Well, you're definitely not alone, because over here in Milan, things are just as hot. My new best mate is my air conditioner. So I guess as long as we have that going for us, we're definitely doing well. And we're definitely today, I think, is going to be a great one, because you've selected quite the movie for us to talk about. Because today, folks, we are reviewing Joanna d'Arc of Mongolia. This was, of course, selected by Beth. It was directed and written by Ulrike Oettinger. It was released to the general public on March the 30th of 1989 and has a runtime of roughly 2 hours and 45 minutes. So getting to general impressions here, Beth, I believe this was probably not the first time you got to see it. So what did you make of this film, and what made you decide to bring it to the podcast?
Oh, I'm going to start with why I decided to bring it with the podcast, and then I'll talk about my impressions. I really wanted to bring it to the podcast because it's so hard to see Ottinger movies. It's becoming a little easier as she is heading some repertory cinemas, and she just had a brand new release come out that drove a lot of attention to her too. Die Blutgräfin, the Blood Countess, starring Isabelle Huppert as Lady Bathory. And I really want to see that movie, but so far it's only premiered at the 76th Berlin International Film Festival. But that got me thinking back of movies I've seen by Ottinger, and I'm really fond of this one. It left me with a feel good impression. There's a lot of positivity to it. I was introduced to it when I took a women filmmakers class at Hampshire College by Joan Braderman. And it was such a great class for really getting into women filmmakers. It was in the early aughts, so it was still a little bit on the earlier wave of it. So we saw Agnes Varda's Cleo from 5 to 7, Lizzie Borden's Born in Flames, Chantal Ackerman's Jean Diomen 23 de Commence 1427, and of course some Ottinger movies like Ticket of No Return, Bildnis eine Trinkerin, and Joan d'Arc of Mongolia. So a little bit of nostalgia brought me back to this movie, the feelings that it gave me. And also I noticed when I looked up Joan Braderman, who was a video artist herself, that she had passed away in 2025. So in talking about this film, it's a little bit of a tribute to her. I didn't keep in touch with her, but she has an amazing legacy of her work and of inspiring other women filmmakers. And she really expanded my education of film. So it's all part of my nostalgia and a little bit of a thank you to her. And I hope in us talking about this film that we bring more attention to Ottinger, this work in particular, and to get people to check out her other works as well. So my general impression of the movie, well, when I first heard about Ottinger from Joan, she said there's this lesbian filmmaker who's influenced by the golden age of cinema. She makes these costume dramas that sometimes feel like period pieces. And I was just all on board to check out her work because, of course, I do love classic film. And I want to see what somebody who's kind of avant-garde, experimental, cult art house is doing with that kind of influence. And my impression with this movie is we've got two movies that pierce together with a transition about an hour in. The first top part of the movie is kind of like that classic golden age of cinema train movie. We've got all these archetypes packed into a train. We're going to learn about all these characters, and they're mostly Europeans, but there are some Americans in there too. Sometimes when people talk about the film, they emphasize all the Europeans on the train, but there are some American characters. And one of the interesting things about the characters, whether they're European or not, is a good majority of them are entertainers. And there's a big talk about different ways culture is exchanged and the ways that culture meet each other. And one of the things is an example is given how American culture takes all the immigrants in and spits out a new pop culture to everybody. And we get some examples of this with some of these archetypal characters. For example, we've got Fanny Ziegfeld, obviously named in tribute to the great entertainer, and she herself is a Broadway entertainer. We've got her with the Russian Kalinka sisters, and then we've also got Mickey Katz, Yiddish theater star, and they all take times to entertain us, which is another glorious part of the classic film, the musical interludes, which are a lot of fun in this. But they have this song in it called oh, let me make sure I don't say the title wrong, but we've got by Mir Bistushane, To Me You're Beautiful. And in the United States, this became a huge hit. It was actually in a Yiddish theater flop, but it became something beloved by all Americans and even went across the seas. And so Odinger has the characters talk about Americanization a bit, but also there's a lot about Westernization. But this showed how a one-time minority culture could influence a greater culture in our country by this song being so popular that it became a hit in the United States. And now it's actually crossing in this beautiful train. And the train itself is in the nostalgia. There's the romance of the train travel, but also nostalgia. Sometimes you see things a little bit with rose-colored glasses, and the train isn't necessarily in the best shape. When we get a little bit of a glimpse of the way that different people live and travel in the train, we will meet a character called Lady Windmere, and she has the best accommodations, but still her train car has a huge crack in the back of it and a broken window in the back. So it's sort of glamorous, but a little bit shabby as well of what it is like being on this train. And then we also get a little difference in people by what we get insights into their class by what part of the train they're in. Lady Windermere has a private berth. She has her own train car. There's others who have little roomettes that they share. And there's yet again the lowest ticket passenger who has to sit upright in the hard chairs all the way through the ride too. So we get a little bit of these cultures mixing, archetypes mixing, these different classes mixing all in one vehicle. The amazing thing is nobody's quite snobby about anything. There's a lot of camaraderie on this train. There's a lot of sharing food, invitations to dine together, to spend time together. And then all of a sudden, about an hour in, the movie changes and it becomes a wholly different kind of movie. We go from like this classical kind of train movie and all these cultures mixing to a new culture coming in. And we've got a Mongolian princess, her retinue, her warriors, and they have put a giant mound of dirt on the tracks and they stop the train. And they decide that they're going to take only the women hostage. They leave the men. And it's kind of a funny thing because they were going to go from the Trans-Siberian Railway to the Trans-Mongolian. And in one scene, there's that guy, Mickey Katz, who's not really that one of the men that's that appreciated. And he says, what a pity I'm not traveling with you. And they all smile and say nothing. And so now we have only the women being pulled off by the Mongolian princess. And they get to travel with them. And all of a sudden, it becomes more like an ethnographic film where we have these people who seem like maybe they're from the 1940s going into a kind of timeless culture and getting exposed to that. And we see their reactions to that. And it almost is like the film we talked about last time where they had ethnographic elements, The White Reindeer last year. Oh, this one gets hardcore into it where we see the customs, the rituals, the superstitions, how to set up a temporary camp. We even see a scene that might be hard for the animal lover where we do see a goat sacrificed to become a feast meal at one point too. So there's a lot of the culture that gets demonstrated to us, and we get to see how these women are transformed by their interactions with each other in the East meets West.
Very well said for sure. And, definitely keep me posted when we get that Countess Bathory movie, because I've always been a huge, huge fan of the Blood Countess. Well, not of her necessarily, but the myth and thing has always fascinated me. So definitely keep me posted if you know where one can get one's hands on that movie, because I definitely want to check that one out after having seen this one. And and then very eloquently said, I mean, because here's the thing, this was the first time I sat down to watch this one. I'm so glad you brought it to our attention, because what stayed with me with this one was not a plot or a destination. There was very much a feeling of drifting between worlds, as you were kind of alluding to. It does feel like a film that is less interested in telling a conventional story and more interested in creating a space where, as you were saying, cultures, myths, and histories and fantasies all collide. And watching it, I had the sense that, like you were saying, reality is being gently rearranged, as if travel itself becomes a kind of dream. And what I found most striking is how patient this film is, because it doesn't rush toward dramatic resolutions. Instead, it lingers on landscapes and rituals and conversations and costumes and gestures, allowing them to accumulate meaning over time. And I think the result can feel very hypnotic, at least to me, occasionally bewildering, and sometimes deliberately excessive. And there are moments where I felt completely immersed and others where I felt held at a distance. But I suspect that tension was part of the point. Also, I think the film seems fascinated by the way people imagine places they don't belong to. It does explore the boundary between genuine curiosity and romantic projection, never really settling to a simple answer. And I very much came away feeling that it's both enchanted by cultural difference and quietly questioning the ways that difference is viewed and collected and transformed into stories. Like you were saying, visually, this struck me as very lavish and theatrical, and the images often felt closer to a moving gallery exhibition than to mainstream cinema. There is very much a richness to the compositions that make even still moments feel alive, and the landscapes carry as much weight as any dialogue, very much creating a sense of scale that is both physical and symbolic. But more than anything, I think of it as a film about, like you were saying, crossing thresholds. Not just geographical ones, but imaginative and cultural ones as well. And I felt it very much invited me, and I think it invites the audience to surrender expectations of realism and narrative efficiency, and instead experience cinema as a journey through ideas and images and possibilities. Whether I find it beautiful, strange, or frustrating, or fascinating at any given moment, I never found it ordinary. And that, to me, is its lasting achievement, is that it's not an ordinary film. And once again, I'm so glad that you brought it to the Gold Standard Theatre. So let's get to our characters on the board, starting with our four women. We have the aforementioned Herman as Müller von Winkle, Delphine Seyrig as Lady Windermere, Gillian Scalici as Fanny Ziegfeld, and Ines Sastre as Giovanna. So what did you make of our four main women, Beth?
Well, that Frau Müller von Winkle, she's so much fun because she's such a stereotypical school teacher. She's reserved, she's timid, she's bookish, she's constantly consulting her Baedeker. And I'm kind of wondering if Ottinger is making fun of a type, but I'm also wondering if she's making a nod to another movie, because A Room with a View had characters that were famously traveling around with their Baedekers until they decided to go off the beaten track accidentally with and Miss Honeychurch and George Emerson in that movie. So I think there's a little bit of a nod because that's also a travel movie, and that came out in 1985, and this one came out later in 1989. But she starts off as the character who seems least interested in change, and she ultimately becomes one of the most transformed characters in the whole movie. The being held hostage is frightening for her when she's pulled off the train with the other women to go to the Mongolian encampment. She's not one to try fatty foods, and she's instructed, please don't insult our host. Please eat at least some of this, and you can take the rest with you. Do not dispose of it in their view. And she knows nothing about their customs. And there's a hilarious scene where she accidentally offends them because she washes her clothes and she starts to hang her clothes up And it's revealed that that's considered a terrible thing of bad luck until she's able to have translated to her what's happening. But I think because of the comfort and bravery of the other women, that at some point she relaxes a little more, and then she will have a spiritual transformation when she wanders into a cave and she meets the temple's mistress, and she's guided silently on how to worship, and it's the most peaceful that you see her in the entire movie, where she's finally found a bit of the culture that she can connect to. So that's a very kind of cool transformation from a character that you weren't really sure what was going to happen to her with this. And then with the Lady Windermere, played by Delphine Seyrig, well, she's really if she was in a classic Hollywood film, this would be the Marlene Dietrich role. She's worldly, she's sophisticated, she's knowledgeable, she's a amateur anthropologist. She's just really out there to explore and travel. So for her to have this sort of confrontation with the Mongolian princess and her warriors, it's exciting to her. She looks forward to it. She relishes to see that what can I learn from them? What can I experience? In some ways, she's going to be the least transformed character in the whole movie because she's already game and open to experience. She's very experienced and she just wants more. But she's also our frame into it because she is knowledgeable. She translates customs, she translates the language for her fellow travelers, and she's doing the same for us as the audience as well. And I think one thing to note about her that sometimes people become confused by, because the actress herself is French, the character is not French, the character is English. She's an English woman who loves her tea and talks about her Western lifestyle in England and her travels. So it's important to note that she's like one of the most relaxed and open English women ever depicted on screen in this kind of a situation. She's like really, she takes almost a role that sometimes you would see a male in a movie where he would be the explorer traveling the country. So it's kind of a transformation of a role, and to see what a confident female in that kind of perspective would be. The other thing that's kind of interesting too is you can kind of debate what her relationship is exactly with Giovanna, a character that I'll get to in a moment. Is kind of open to interpretation because, Ottinger is a lesbian, and Delphine Seyrig, she's famous for Daughters of Darkness, an erotic vampire thriller that's known for being a landmark for the lesbian vampire subgenre. Like that has some resonance there. Is it a romantic relationship with Giovanna there, or is it more of a maternal mentor kind of relationship? Just like an old classic Hollywood film, we're never really given that definitive a moment. When they wake up after they share the train car, each one is in a separate bed, although there is some physical affection. And then in another way too, with her being older and mentoring Giovanna, there'll be a complication later with another character. But moving on to Fanny. Fanny is exotic in this area because she's an American. She's out of her element. And so even though the scenery, the cultures, the people are exotic to her, she is exotic and of interest. And the funny thing is, Lady Windermere had heard of her. When they're in the dining car, Lady Windermere mentions who she is to Giovanna, and Fanny is very excited to be recognized, sitting there very pleased. There's also some funny scenes too with Fanny in the dining car, because she, just like Frau Mueller von Winkle, is dining at more of a tourist level. So they have these little funny tourist booklets where they take a little ticket out, and so they're guaranteed a lower quality meal. Meanwhile, we've got the very wealthy Mickey Katz in the same car, and he's ordering lavish feasts that feature stuffed swans. And so they're very excited for their little tourist meal they're going to share together, the Frau and Fanny. And then they discover that the train staff made an assumption and assumed that Katz would be Orthodox. and they've ordered an endless amount of prepackaged kosher meals. And so poor Franny and the Frau are consigned to a whole travel of gravyless prepackaged meals. So it's a little bit funny how they take to that together. But she's game with everything. She provides the entertainment. She wants to stay too when they're kidnapped and invited to stay at the camp. Frau Mueller Winkle is saying, "Oh, I've paid for all these hotels. I'm going to lose my money on stays that I'm not going to have." Meanwhile, Fanny provides a contrast because she said, "Well, I have all these store stops. I'm supposed to be paid. I'm actually going to lose my income and break contracts, and it's going to hurt my reputation." But she is game for staying because she wants the experience. She wants to see what happens. And I also love her costuming. This is one character in which she gets a lot of those 1940s style costumes. She's got this one red dress that looks more like 1980s meets 1940s with the poofed power shoulders. That's a lot of fun. And she's also one of the female characters that will don pants when she's out and about. But the most glamorous strapless pant set you've ever seen as she wanders around the steps. So that's a lot of fun. And then the next final of the featured four female characters is Giovanna. She comes across as very modern. She looks like a modern backpacker student in her denim attire, in her jacket. She's a third class passenger. She doesn't even have a seat. She's on some bizarre hammock. But then Lady Windermere takes a fascination to her and she's this, she sees the opportunity to teach this young woman all about the travels and to have a delightful, beautiful companion with her. And so she's just kind of letting whim and good luck guide her. And Frau von Winkle it warns her, admonishes her, "You don't know what can happen to you. This is dangerous." But Giovanna, with her youth and beauty, she almost has a little bit of a pretty privilege where, she gets plucked out of the third class steerage. She gets to have all these marvelous adventures and be in a berth that's above what she could afford with her ticket. And she has a significant transformation too, where she starts to embody a little bit of the mixture of East meets West because she is very influenced by the princess that she meets and very excited to learn more about the culture. So she goes first from Lady Windermere teaching her about the culture from the outside to getting inside the culture and learning from it about the princess. And the princess takes her in as her special friend, which is obviously romantic. So she's embracing the East in all these different ways, physically, emotionally, educationally, all these different ways. And at the end, she physically becomes an in-between space with East meets West because her student garb becomes half Mongolian garb and half denim. She's got a Mongolian hat on, Mongolian vest, but she's still got her denim clothing on too. So that's kind of cool with it. And then what did you think about these main four?
I will say this first off, as I told you before, we got set down to record this. I was so surprised to even see Ines Sastre in a film because for the longest time, I knew Ines as being obviously a fashion model, and she was very well known over here in Italy for that. So, and she'd make appearances here and there on TV shows, but obviously everybody knew her as Ines Sastre, the fashion model. So I was very surprised when it came to that, when the credits started rolling. But yeah, getting to these characters. First off, I also wanted to start with Frau von Winkle. She very much came across to me as one of the film's most quietly fascinating presences because, like you were mentioning, Herman often had a gift for portraying figures who seem rigid, controlled, or socially defined, yet reveal these unexpected depths beneath the surface. I think in this film, she's embodying, a distinctly European bourgeois sensibility, very practical, structured, and initially anchored in familiar cultural assumptions. What I think makes her compelling is watching those assumptions, like you were alluding to, gradually encounter something beyond their normal frame of reference. I think her restrained style, the actress, helps ground a film that is otherwise full of spectacle and excess, Whereas Lady Windermere, by contrast, I think feels almost born from artifice and performance. She brings this elegance and self-awareness that makes the character seem simultaneously real and theatrical. Because she does carry herself as if she belongs to a world of stories and literature and cultivated fantasy. And in many ways, I think she seems to personify the film's fascination with travel as imagination rather than mere geography. Fanny struck me very much as one of the film's most playful embodiments of performance and self-invention, because she does contribute to the sense that everyone aboard this journey is presenting a better version of themselves, consciously or unconsciously. And I think this character very much helps blur the boundary between authentic identity and theatrical display. Whereas Giovanna, I think, very much brings a different quality altogether, because her presence definitely feels less burdened by history and self-performance than some of the others. There is very much, I think, a freshness and receptivity about her that allows her to function almost as a vessel for wonder. And in a film filled with strong personalities and elaborate cultural signifiers, I think Giovanna often feels unusually direct and open. What I did find especially interesting is how these four presences very much create a spectrum, because Müller-Wollwinkel very much represents order and social structure. Lady Windermere embodies cultivated theatricality. Fanny leans into performance and spectacle, and Giovanna suggests openness and transformation. So I think together they help create the film's unique atmosphere where cultural observation, fantasy, and self-fashioning are constantly interacting with one another. And I really enjoyed the performances from all of them, especially Ines Sastre, who I will definitely applaud for her performance. Speaking of fun performances, let's get to our Kalinka sisters. We have Jacinta as 1, Else Nabu as 2, and Sivimbike Elbe as 3. So, Beth, your thoughts on our very colorful Kalinka sisters?
Well, one of the fun things about them is they're often there, but unless they're singing, they don't often speak. They're almost a little bit often like this amazing trio, this girl group who provide entertainment on demand when it's time for it, but also they have such style. They are obsessed with their style, which again, if you want to talk about like artifice with it, they have the most amazing cat eye sunglasses that they wear during different scenes. They are the characters that never wear pants in the movie. They never show that practicality. Even when they're out on the steps, they're wearing these extremely long gowns that are black floral, which would be incredibly hot out in that environment. So in a way, they're always presenting an image of themselves and of their girl group, a unified image as well. And they're providing entertainment at the beginning of the movie in the train. They're observing with the other women, the Mongolian princess and her warriors. And then at the end of the movie, we get yet another performance of them as well. So they are bringing people together as they perform, but in a way, they're a little bit of mystery. I think only one of them ever has a name other than Kalinka sister.
Exactly, yeah, because I was, here's the thing. When I was actually looking up the credits, I was like, so what are the names of these characters? And then, I guess through obviously, thank you, IMDb and so on, they just gave them numbers, literally, because almost to make them, like you said, they're 3 individuals, but it's almost like one entity, almost, it's like, I mean, I wanted to almost use the word Greek choir, but I don't really think their function is that for a Greek choir. But that was the kind of impression, if you know what I mean, in the sense that it's one entity, even though it's 3 people, because I think they're the most, you made a great point. I think they're the most enigmatic and delightful presences in this film, because unlike figures who carry clear social identities or symbolic roles, they very much do seem to exist in a space between performance, folklore, parody, and even dream. And what really struck me about them is how perfectly they fit Ottinger's vision of cinema as a kind of traveling cabinet of curiosities. So I think they don't feel constrained by ordinary realism. They very much arrive, like you were alluding to, as living embodiments of excess and artifice and cultural collage. Because their appearances, their behavior, their performances, they contribute to the sense that the film is populated by figures who have wandered in from different traditions and genres and fantasies. And I very much felt that they introduced a note of joyful instability, was the best I could come up with. Because whenever they're present, the film seems less concerned with explaining itself and more interested in celebrating spectacle for its own sake. Yet there is also something subtly unsettling about them. Because they're amusing and charming, but they never entirely resolve into familiar character types. They do remain slightly mysterious, as though they belong to almost a parallel version of reality. In a broader sense, I think they embody one of the film's central ideas, that identity is performative and fluid at the same time. Because I think throughout the film, people are constantly presenting themselves through costumes and stories and rituals and cultural roles. And this will also play a big part when we get to our twist ending, which we will talk about. I think the sisters make this process visible and very playful, because they are performers, but in Oettinger's world, almost everyone is performing something. So, to kind of connect them to our four ladies, if Giovanna evokes openness, Müller-Vorwinkel social structure, and Lady Windermere cultivated fantasy, then the Kalinka sisters represent pure theatricality. They very much reminded me that the film is not merely about a journey across physical space. It's also a journey through styles and myths and cultural images, and yes, acts of self-invention. What I love most about them is that they resist interpretation. Many films, and I'm sure you've seen this too, ask us to decode every character psychologically. The sisters, I think, invite a different response. I think they invite us simply to watch and listen and enjoy their strangeness. In the film, I think already rich with eccentricity, they're among the most memorable expressions of freedom, playfulness, and imagination. Maybe they could almost be seen as a physical representation of Oettinger herself. So I thoroughly enjoyed them for multiple reasons. I always thought they were hysterical. Yet, as I said, a little bit unsettling for some reason. So this one's going to be an interesting one. Speaking of performances, let's round off our characters with our princess. We have Zurewar as Princess Ulan Iga. So what did you make of our very enigmatic princess?
I'm trying to think about how I can talk about her without talking about the very end, which we're going to talk about later too. If we talk about her at the beginning, it's one of the things that's interesting is about how she intentionally seeks out the women on the train to come with them, because she didn't have to do that. But she really wants them to come, and she really wants them to observe what she and the women are doing together. She wants them as part of their encampment. She wants them to experience and witness their traditions, and she really wants that interaction with them. And she's very generous to them and open to them, which you wouldn't necessarily expect, because some other people could be a little bit worried about being the exotic to these Westerners coming in. Could there be any exploitation of it? But because this is such an optimistic film of it, it's just when they come together and when she has them observe and when she has them participate, it's just truly beneficial for all of them. And we get to see a little bit too of what it's like, because it almost feels a little bit like The Women at first, where that 1939 movie where they said, oh, there's not a single man on the screen. For a bit of the film, there's not a single man on the screen, and she's kind of creating this kind of almost utopia with these women. The first time it gets interrupted, it feels dangerous. It feels like for the princess, these men are coming, and it looks like a huge group of men with cattle. They've got this housing. You worry for the princess. Is she in danger? Is are will her women be in danger? What is going to happen here? Is there going to be an attack? But fortunately for the princess, this other group that's referred to as the black tent or the black yurt, and she's her group is referred to the white yurt. They've come to make amends, and they had actually caused her father and her people to suffer. When her father was ailing, they actually pillaged her people's animals and belongings, possessions, homes, and they have had nothing but bad luck. And we get a little bit of the mythology with the talk of 777s, so many sevens, while they talk about what would be good fortune and what is bad fortune, but everything bad has happened to these other people since they harmed her family and her tribe. And it's actually a beneficial thing. They leave with gifts after they've gone and like made a compact to be peaceful with each other again. And then this disruption by the men is done. Like filmmaker John Ford used to say, I don't like having a woman on screen. She always disrupts the action. But in this part of it, it's the men who disrupt the action from a moment. But it's still fascinating because we get to see what these rituals are that are involved with making peace with the Mongolians. How do they make peace? How do they come to the compact? What do they say to each other? The language that they use. And then once that part of it is done, we get to see the princess and how her group travels and sets up temporary homes, how they have the celebrations and all of that. And it's really interesting to see too her romance with Giovanna, where she's just very straightforward. She relays that she's interested in Giovanna to Lady Windermere, who passes on the message with her too. And there's nothing that's bashful. There's no shame. She's just upfront and honest with it. And it's a funny thing because Giovanna ends up being involved in maybe different ways with these two very strong female characters. One of them just happens to be her own age, although she outranks her in her culture and in power of the moment. So it's a kind of fascinating thing, but the princess doesn't really abuse her power. She doesn't she's not there to do anything negative to any of the women or anything harmful. East has decided to meet West, and East is indoctrinating West into it and welcoming it with open arms for the transformation. And then I'm going to skip saying about the very, very end of it. Yeah.
I will say this, I definitely did not see that coming. And and I think that's the mark of a good film if you can't predict how it's going to end. But more on that later. And I also wanted to add in as a side, at first, the relationship between Giovanna and Lady Windermere reminded me slightly of the relationship we get with the second Mrs. De Winter and, should we say, her tutor in Rebecca, because it seemed like she was almost trying to educate her to be a companion, if you know what I mean. But then, obviously, it changes. So at first, I wondered whether that was almost either a homage to Rebecca or a homage to that, where you would have young women being educated on how to be a companion, be it for a man, or in this case, obviously, it turns out to be a woman. But getting to our princess, she very much, I think, is the gravitational center of the film. Because while many of the other figures seem to drift through the film as travelers and performers and observers, or even embodiments of particular cultural attitudes, the princess possesses, I think, a remarkable sense of certainty. She feels less like a conventional character and more like a force around which the film reorganizes itself. What I found most interesting is that she can be read in several ways at once. Because on one level, she does appear as an object of fascination, as you were talking about, the embodiment of a world that the travelers encounter and try to understand. Yet the film does not simply reduce her to an exotic image. There are moments when it feels as though the gaze is reversed, and it's the visitors who become the objects of observation. And I think in those moments, the princess acquires a quiet authority that challenges the assumptions carried by those around her. She also, I think, brings a sense of myth into the film. Many of the European figures are tied to social roles and professions and habits and performances. The princess often seems connected to something larger, things like history and tradition and landscape and even collective memory. Whether one sees this as romanticization or as deliberate myth making on Oettinger's part is open to debate, but I think the effect is undeniable. She does carry this aura that elevates many of her scenes beyond ordinary realism. At the same time, I don't think her power comes solely from symbolism. What I think makes her so memorable is her composure. In a film filled with these eccentric personalities and this elaborate theatricality, she often appears calm, self-possessed, and fully at home within her own world. And that confidence, I think, creates a striking contrast. Because others seem to define themselves through performance, she often appears to exist beyond the need for it. Yet, of course, we later do find out it is a performance. But what stayed with me most is that she embodies one of the film's central tensions. The difference between fantasy and presence. Because many people project meanings onto her and onto the culture she represents, yet she continually exceeds those projections. The film may surround her with mythic imagery, but she never feels entirely captured by it. So if I were to summarize my impression in a single thought, it would be this. I think the princess is the figure who transforms the film from a curious travel fantasy into a meditation on perspective itself. Because she's not merely someone to be looked at. She does become the presence that quietly questions who is doing the looking and why, especially when we take our ending into consideration. And I think that is what gives her such lasting power in the film and a very, I think, very clever addition to the movie, especially when we find out the final twist, which we'll get to right now, because the last scene finds our princess, the warrior queen of the Mongolian steppe, on the train with Lady Windermere, wearing a Western-style dress, mentioning how much she loves Chanel perfume, and it turns out she's fully Westernized and was only with her nomadic tribe on the steppe for summer vacation, as we learn what happened. Oh, and then we, of course, learn what happened to our other characters. And I absolutely loved this twist. So let's hear your thoughts, Beth, on how our movie ended.
I love the twist as well because it even on a this was my second time of viewing the film when I watched it, and it's still kind of startling because it feels dreamlike because the princess is in the train car with Lady Windermere, but we have left them behind. We've left Giovanna and the princess behind. So it feels like some kind of dream. How did the princess get into this car with Lady Windermere, but there's no Giovanna there yet? And she's holding her own too with Lady Windermere, which is nice because Lady Windermere is going on and on about her own self-mythology, about how rich she is, about these wonderful chinois paintings that she has. And then the princess has to say that she has her own paintings where people are in Western dress in hers. And she has to say, I have my paintings too. And she is holding her own, like you said. She is not shy. She's very confident. She speaks when she has something to say, and she sits there like a true princess, completely confident. And the thing that throws me for a loop with it is figuring out the metaphysics of everything, because there, like I said, there she is with Lady Windermere. When we previously saw her, we said goodbye as the Western ladies, except for Giovanna, boarded the train. And then in the background, in the window, we see Giovanna approaching on horseback, and she's still wearing the same outfit she was the last time we saw her, even though the princess is in a completely different outfit. There's no sense of how much time has passed. How did this happen, the separation? And Giovanna, like a romantic hero, jumps onto the train from the horse and then is pulled in by Lady Windermere. And this trio is reunited at the end of the movie. And it's just, it's a lot of fun to see. And the only one who's off kilter is Giovanna, which is so funny on that end of it. Yeah.
As I said before, I love this ending because at first, when we see the princess in, perfect Western style dress, I was like, is that the same person? And of course, it turns out it is. But what surprised me about this ending is, it landed as kind of a quiet reversal. And I think that effect was deliberately uncomfortable in a productive way. As you mentioned, being thrown for a loop, because up to that point, the film encourages you to take the encounter at face value. The sustained meeting between European travelers and a nomadic world that feels distant, staged, and almost mythic in its presentation. You do settle into that structure. One side observes, the other is observed. And even when the film plays with theatricality, it still feels like there are distinct cultural worlds being crossed. And then the ending pulls the rug slightly, because seeing the princess back on the train in Western clothing, I think very much reframed everything. Because the figure who seemed to anchor the idea of an untouched, sovereign other world turns out to move easily between contexts. That shift doesn't just update her character, it destabilizes the entire way the film has been asking you to look. And what I take from that is less a plot, it could be less of a plot twist than a critique of perception. The film has been making you aware all along that what you're watching is shaped by staging, framing, and projection. The ending makes that very explicit. I think it suggests that the authentic encounter you may have been tempted to believe in was always mediated, always partially constructed, even when it felt immersive. But I don't think it collapses into a simple nothing is real idea. I think it feels more precise than that. It's, I think, very much about how easily cultural difference gets aesthetized and turned into an experience that can be entered and exited at will. And Ulan Iga's final appearance doesn't erase her earlier presence so much, I think, as expose how unstable the categories around her were: traveler, native, observer, spectacle. So my sense of the ending was this, that it gently but firmly refuses the comfort of a clear boundary between worlds. I think it leaves you with the uneasy realization that what looked like an encounter with alterity might also be a circulation of roles and costumes and expectations. And once that possibility is visible, it changes how the entire journey sits in memory. So, as I said before, I very much applaud Ulrike for doing such a great job with this ending, which is why, you were mentioning earlier, wanting to seek out more of her films. I certainly do. And I'm very, very curious to see what she would do with a character like Elizabeth Bathory, who has such a mythology weaved around her. Some might say it's true, some might say it isn't. I mean, I doubt she actually bathed in blood, but apparently the things that she did were not particularly nice, to put it mildly. But I'm very curious to see what somebody like Ulrike could do with a character like that, seeing what she did when it came to a Mongolian princess. So I guess then, did you have anything else you wanted to add when it came to the ending? If we're not, we can get to if we were the Academy.
Yes, I just want to say I do think that Ottinger kind of tricks us with what's real and not real. Just to go back to how the first half of the movie, everything is obviously a set. Even the train stations they pass look more like theatrical sets than train stations. So she really does trick us by presenting nature as more real and the first part of the movie as fake. So when she does her twist about what is real and what is not, I think the visual settings have played into that part as well, and it really adds to it. And also, I just want to say, Delphine Seyrig played Lady Bathory in Daughters of Darkness, so there's a kind of maybe connection.
Wow. Speaking of twists, that's quite the one indeed. So I'll definitely have to watch that one myself. That's why I actually missed that one. So being a vampire fan, I guess I'll have to definitely watch that one indeed, and especially if she plays Elizabeth Bathory. So let's get if we were the Academy segment. Lamentably, this film was not nominated for anything at the 1989 Academy Awards, where Driving Miss Daisy was the film with the most nominations and awards among these Best Picture. So when it comes to the Academy, Beth, why do you think this film was not nominated for anything? And should it have been nominated for something, or could it have even won an Oscar?
Sometimes I get a little cynical about the Academy because a lot of their nominations to me feel political, or they're wanting to make a statement, or they're rewarding someone for previous work as a makeup for the next year. And I don't know if Driving Miss Daisy has really stood the test of time. I think it was an attempt at a time to have racial discussions, but I don't know about it standing the test of time. If anything, I think it's too quirky and too offbeat for the Academy of 1989 to be in a general mainstream Best Picture nominee. If it had anything, it would be what we call Best International Picture now. And I just love it. And I would award it Best International Picture because it just brings so much, asks so much, and leaves behind such a feeling of positivity and cultural exchange and ideas that it it's it moves the needle more than Driving Miss Daisy did.
Yes, and if either Rachel or Zan were here, they would warmly agree with you. When it comes to the if we were the Academy segment with this one, I think the short answer is that I don't think it was nominated because it was never, as you were mentioning, in the Oscar system in the way mainstream American films like Driving Miss Daisy were, and because its style, the production context, and the distribution didn't align with how the Academy typically selects nominees. And a few concrete reasons matter here. First, visibility and distribution. I mean, this film is an art house, internationally produced film with a very limited release, especially in the US. Oscars heavily favor films with strong US distribution campaigns, industry screenings, and marketing pushes. Without that machinery, even highly regarded films rarely get onto the ballot. Second, the style and the accessibility, as you were mentioning, because Ulrike's film is intentionally slow, almost episodic, and visually theatrical. It's closer to experimental cinema or gallery-like narrative art than to conventional storytelling. And the Academy, especially in the late 80s, tended to reward clear narrative structure, character psychology, and emotional legibility. And that year, something like Driving Miss Daisy, I think, fits that expectation almost perfectly. The third category mismatch, even in international feature considerations, the film's hybrid nature makes it hard to classify. It's not a straightforward national submission narrative, and it doesn't follow the kind of linear dramatic arc that Oscar voters usually respond to. Because as we know, films that win or get nominated tend to translate easily across cultural and narrative expectations. Now, should it have been nominated? I think that depends on what you think the Oscars are for. Because if the question is, was it one of the most formally ambitious and conceptually bold films of that year, you could absolutely make a case that it deserves recognition. Because Ulrike Oettinger's work pushes cinematic language in a way that very few mainstream films of the time attempted. Its exploration of gaze and cultural staging and performance is so sophisticated and still feels modern. If the question is, does it fit with the Academy historically rewards? Then, of course, the answer is no. It was almost never going to be a candidate. The Oscars don't function, as we know, sadly, I would say, as a neutral ranking of global cinema. They do reflect a specific industry taste shaped by accessibility, narrative clarity, and campaign visibility. Could it have won? Realistically, I hate to say this, no. Even getting nominated would have required a major shift, I think, in what voters were willing to recognize as best picture level storytelling in 1989. It's not just that it was overlooked. I think it sits in a different cinematic category altogether. So I think the interesting takeaway isn't that it was snubbed in a simple sense, but that it reveals how narrow the award ecosystem can be. Films like this don't compete on the same track as Oscar favorites, sadly. That is a limitation of the Academy. And they're often not in the race at all because they're running a different kind of race. It's like one is doing long jump, the other's doing track. So it's like, they're just two different categories, which is very sad. And I think it maybe is a criticism towards the Oscars. They should be more open-minded, possibly. So let's get to ratings then. What do you give this movie out of 10?
Oh, goodness. I always have the hardest time with ratings because I like the movie a lot. Let me think about it. But it's so hard for me to give anything a 10. I think, even though I like it a lot, I'm going to give it an 8. I'm going to give it an 8 because I really like it, but I don't know. I think I did enjoy it being slow, and luxuriating in a lot of it, but maybe sometimes maybe a little too slow. I'm going to say 8. 8. Yeah.
And I think that's definitely a very, very fair rating. I'm actually going to go half a point higher than you. I'm going to give this an 8.5 out of 10. Not because it's almost perfect in a conventional sense, because this film, let's be honest, is not conventional, but because it achieves something very specific and unusually coherent in its own language. What I think it does extremely well is build a world of perception rather than plot. The film commits fully to a stylized, staged, almost theatrical approach to travel and cultural encounter, and it never breaks that spell. And that kind of consistency is very rare. It doesn't soften its edges to make itself easier. It asks you to adjust instead. I also think its biggest strength is how it treats looking itself as the subject. Because the film isn't really about Mongolia or Europe in a straightforward way. It's about how people construct the other through performance, costume, expectation, and framing. And that idea could easily become didactic. But I think here it stays alive because it's expressed through images, pacing, and structure rather than explanation. It's showing you, it's not telling you. And the performances fit that vision. People aren't really playing psychologically transparent characters. They're presenting shifting identities, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. And that creates a strange balance between satire, beauty, and unease that holds surprisingly well over its long runtime because, let's be honest, this movie is almost 3 hours long, and being able to play with that runtime and do it well, it does take a master craftsman, in just like Ulrike is. Where it loses points for me is also tied to that same approach, though, because the deliberate slowness and repetition can feel draining, especially if you're not fully in sync with its rhythm. There are stretches where the conceptual intent is clear, but the emotional sensory variation thins out a bit. It's not incoherent, it's just intentionally unrelenting. And I'd also say it's a film that won't convert skeptical viewers. It doesn't offer many entry points if you're expecting traditional character arcs or narrative payoff. That limits its reach, even if it is part of its artistic identity. So I think my score reflects that balance. It's not trying to be universally accessible, but within its own aims, it's bold, it's controlled, and distinctive enough to stand well above most films that year in terms of formal ambition. And I was also thinking about this when we talk about if we were the Academy, because if you put a movie like this next to other major 1989 films, makes the contrast pretty sharp. Because it wasn't competing on the same artistic assumptions at all. You start with the obvious heavyweight of that year, talking Drive Miss Daisy. That film is built on clarity, a linear story, recognizable emotional progression, and character relationships that evolve in a readable, reassuring way. It's engineered for accessibility and broad consensus. I think that's a big reason it worked so well with the Academy and general audiences. Oettinger's film, by contrast, almost avoids that kind of emotional handrail. It's not trying to guide you toward agreement or resolution. It's asking you to stay inside ambiguity and spectacle instead. Excuse me. And then you have something like Dead Poets Society that came out that year. That one also leans into emotional clarity, but it's more inspirational register. It's structured around uplift and mentorship and a fairly direct emotional payoff. Again, very legible storytelling. Ottinger doesn't build toward catharsis or transformation in that sense. I think, if anything, it resists clean emotional resolution altogether. Every genre film, or every genre, even genre films from that year, like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, show that contrast. I think of Spielberg's film as also about travel and encounter with other spaces, but it's tightly plotted, it's rhythmically paced and designed for continuous momentum. Whereas Ottinger slows everything down, she fragments it and repeatedly interrupts narrative drive with these tableau-like sequences. Both are about journeys, but they treat time and attention in completely different ways. And I think what makes this film interesting in that landscape is that it behaves more like contemporary art cinema than narrative cinema, even compared to most international films that year. And it's closer in spirit to, as we were mentioning earlier, gallery installation, ethnographic collage, or performance art documentation than to anything competing for Oscars or box office dominance. So in that context is why I give it an 8.5. But with a clarification, it's not an 8.5 compared to Hollywood 1989 cinema. It's an 8.5 on the scale of formal ambition and conceptual execution within experimental narrative film. Against mainstream 1989 releases, it's almost not in the same category of judgment at all, which is why I understand you having difficulty rating this one. If anything, the comparison highlights why it was never in awards conversations, and it wasn't overlooked as so much as operating, again, in a different cinematic ecosystem entirely. So forgive the rant, people, but I just wanted to get my point across clearly. But yes, it remains an 8.5 out of 10 for me. So getting to a gold standard feedback this week, we do have some from Aaron Case, who had written regarding our Patreon review of Shawshank Redemption, very different movie from this one, but for some reason, it ended up in our spam email. So apologies to you, Aaron, for getting to this one late. So I will share this one right here in the hope of you listening. He writes in about the Shawshank Redemption, and the subject, I love the subject line he has of this email, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. So Aaron writes in, hello, VIP hosts. Hey, Aaron. I'm so thrilled that you're covering the Shawshank Redemption, a movie that I consider an absolute masterpiece. I'll be honest, when the debate about the best movie ever made gets brought up, at least for American movies, I often cite the Shawshank Redemption as the best of the best. Looking at the story, this movie does something I've always appreciated, in that our main character is not who the story is about. This movie is about Andy and everything he's gone through, yet the story is told through the eyes of Red. One of the reasons this storytelling method is so effective is that we, the audience, are quite confident he's innocent, but never completely sure due to how unreliable Andy's own memory is of that night. However, Red, as our main character and narrator, guides us through this journey of Andy's prison life, and no matter how strong their friendship becomes, even Red doubts Andy's innocence until faced with the truth. I know Zan once stated that she had a hard time with stories involving people wrongly convicted, which I completely understand. However, I do think Andy's wrongful conviction is very important to his character arc. Here is a man who wasn't in a happy marriage and assumed his wife was ultimately at fault due to her affair. It's all his years in prison that he has time to think about his own faults, finally accepting his own shortcomings as a husband, and slowly gaslighting himself into believing that he deserves everything that has happened to him. The only time we get to hear him talk about his relationship, Andy tells Red that he may as well have pulled the trigger. And I appreciate Red's response that being a bad husband doesn't make him a killer, urging Andy to understand that he may not have been a great person in the past, but it doesn't mean he should accept the lies laid upon him. As for the acting, I doubt I can say anything about Freeman and Robbins that the three of you haven't already said. Both are perfect in their roles. Instead, I would like to talk about three other performances. First and foremost, Clancy Brown is near the top of my list of the greatest underappreciated actors. It's funny to me that this man can play a sociopathic prison guard, Highlander's evil Kurgan, promising young women's loving father, and SpongeBob SquarePants' greedy Mr. Krabs. This man has such a range, and here he takes a fairly one-note angry prison guard and breathes life into the character. It's those final moments of being arrested, along with Red, stating that Hadley cried like a little girl, that show Brown is just a hard-headed man with a very soft interior. Next, Bob Gunton is one of those, hey, it's that guy actors that never gets recognition, but always puts in the work. Here, his acting is subtle and very easy to overlook, but he's so strong in his subdued performance. Finally, I've always felt that Gil Bellows doesn't get enough credit for his brief performance as Tommy. Throughout the movie, we see Andy wrongly convicted, while every other inmate feels resigned to the fact that they're in prison, often citing, didn't do it, lawyer fucked me. However, here's Tommy, who seems proud of his criminal ways, fully accountable for his actions, yet even more, here's a convict that finally decides that with a wife and child, he wants to get his life together. Tommy is the only person who decides to improve his life. Brooks may be a kind old man, but he hasn't exactly improved upon himself, but rather got institutionalized and accepted that he had to do his time. And Tommy's death is proof that there are those who don't care about rehabilitation, only punishment. I can't wait to hear your If We Were the Academy segment, because this is a very, very stacked year for movies. Take care, Aaron. Well, thank you so much for that email, Aaron. And I'm so sorry that I overlooked that one when it came to our emails, because spam sometimes does that to me, but I hope you got to listen to it here. And yes, we did get to it. So, Beth, I know that was completely unrelated to our conversation today, but have you, just I guess for curiosity, have you seen The Shawshank Redemption? And do you have anything you would like to comment when it comes to that movie? Putting you on the spot here a little bit, I guess.
Yes, I have seen that movie. The first time was a reissue of it, so I saw it on a big screen and not on the TV. So it was a lot of fun to see it because I had heard so much about it. And the funny thing is, I think it's a big guys movie because the people who always rave about it to me are male. And I think it is a fun movie, and I could see why it hits so well, because it talks about, his masculinity and who he is and his integrity and his identity, and trying to stay true to that, and also to be free of the misperception that he's a killer, and to be physically free from the jail. So I really see why that does hit for a lot of people. That subject has some fun twists to it.
Oh, it most certainly does. And as we'd mentioned actually on the Patreon review of said movie, it's for a lot of us. I mean, at least the three of us, it's probably one of the best adaptations of a Stephen King novella. So, and funny enough, obviously, Frank Darabont, who directed this film, also directed The Green Mile. So clearly, the man knows what he's doing when it comes to Stephen King adaptations. At least when it comes to the non-horror stuff, because of course you can throw in Misery, which is another fantastic film. Rest in peace, Rob Reiner, of course. And that was absolutely brilliant. But yeah, thank you so much for that, Aaron. Definitely appreciated it. And of course, dear listeners, if you want to share your thoughts on the films we discuss here, you can do so by shooting an email to goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Once again, goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Feel free to follow us on our social media. You can find us on X at Oscars Gold, Facebook as Gold Standard The Oscars Podcast, and also Blue Sky, where we're also at Oscars Gold. Love hearing from you guys and appreciate the follow and the support. Also, if you'd like to hear us discuss your favorite movies, you can join our wonderful family of patrons on Patreon, just like Aaron, and check out what we have going on there. Of course, you also get to unlock our previous reviews of such films selected by our patrons, such as recently The Shawshank Redemption, Finding Neverland, Prey, Captain Phillips, and many more. So to join our golden army, head on over to patreon.com/goldstandardoscars, and a big thank you to our wonderful patrons for their support. Speaking of which, in July, our patrons have selected Godzilla -1 for us to review. Another genre change there. I know Zan's very excited about that one. So be sure to check that out, of course. And regardless of the platform you're listening to this podcast on, be sure to rate and review us, as that keeps the algorithm stimulated. And believe you me, folks, that algorithm requires a lot of stimulation. And of course, it allows our little show to reach more like-minded ears like yours. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your pets, tell your princesses. We don't care. Just spread the good word. Big thank you to those who have done so. Future thank you to those who will. So, Beth, when you're not here bringing these fantastic films to the Gold Standard Theatre, where can folks find you on the interwebs?
Sure, they can find my blog, spellboundwithbethann.com. It also has an Instagram, spellboundwithbethann. And then I do still tweet and I skeet as really Beth Ann.
Fantastic stuff. Well, folks, definitely be sure to follow Beth Ann on all the great things she has going on, because believe you me, she's a fabulous blogger and also has really great thoughts on everything. So definitely be sure to hit her up indeed and follow her. When it comes to my missing co-hosts here, you can find, of course, Rachel Friend with the Five-ish Fangirls podcast. They are a geeky and nerdy podcast where they discuss all sorts of geeky and nerdy properties from the female perspective, because as Rachel says, fangirls are real fans too. So, of course, be sure to head to their website. That's the fiveishfangirls.com, where, of course, you can also then connect with all their personal social media accounts as well. When it comes to Zan, you can, of course, find her and our mutual friend Charles Skaggs on the Drunk Cinema podcast, where her and Charles have their favorite beverages, have adult conversations, and literally discuss movies for your entertainment. And of course, if you want to connect with her on social media, your best bets are TikTok and Instagram, where her handle is Udnax19. When it comes to myself, you can find me hosting, at my day job, hosting the radio show Whiskey and Cigarettes, where we play the very best and nothing but the best of country music for you guys, from Alabama to Bailey Zimmerman. And for more information about that, you can visit our website, which is whiskeyandcigarettesshow.com. Podcast-wise, if you're fans of those superhero movies, you can find myself and Keith Bliss on Happiness in Darkness, the superhero movie podcast, where we do discuss any and every superhero movie under the sun and beyond. Speaking of the 80s, we recently reviewed Supergirl, from then, of course, starring Helen Slater, among others. Coming up next, what are we reviewing? Of course, we're reviewing Supergirl from 2026 this time. So it's going to be fun. That's definitely going to be fun. As of this recording, I'm off on Monday, tomorrow, to go and see it in the theaters. I'm very excited about that. And last but certainly not least, you can find myself and that Charles Skaggs guy on the Fandom Zone podcast, where we're currently reviewing the first and so far only season of Spider Noir, and having a great time doing that. And speaking of things to come on this show, excuse me, next time, as our wait for the 99th Best Picture to reveal itself continues, we will be reviewing a movie that I selected, and that will be a very, very big shift change. It will be the 2014 David Fincher film, Gone Girl, our second film, of course, of his on this podcast after Seven. So first off, Beth, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a joy having you on. And of course, I'm sure I speak for Rachel and Zan when I say we look forward to having you back with us again for more of your movie selections.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to return and to chat movies.
The pleasure was certainly ours, of course. So, dear listeners, we will see you next time with Gone Girl, and on Patreon with Godzilla -1. Until then, enjoy those movies. Keep that popcorn hot. Big thank you, of course, to Beth Ann for joining us today. Big thanks to Erin for writing in. And an all-round thank you all so much for the privilege of your time. Ciao, my people.